Greg, I read your amazing book, Rooted in Peace. And what I really loved about it was that I felt that I could go on the journey that you went on. You met these amazing people and you came to some conclusions about our relationship to the natural world and how we develop ourselves as humans and how we relate to the natural world. Where did you start and what did you learn?
Well, first of all, thanks for the accolade. Where did I start? I started, in my backyard in New York filming Pete Seeger. I got invited by a bunch of peaceniks who wanted me to come out. And there's a particular road where there's a fork in the road, and you got different cars coming different direction. And on one side of the road you have the peaceniks, and the other side you have the veterans. And the horns are honking. And you're not sure if they're actually honking for the peaceniks or if they're honking for the war veterans. And this is really where my journey began with, as I was dialoguing with Pete Seeger, and he says, "I don't think you should walk across the street." And I said, "Why not?" He goes, "I don't think they like us." And I said, "Well, let's just try to dialogue." And so I think that's where my journey really began, is really to understand this war, peace movement, and where each side, and trying to figure out what works. What I really came out of my experience was really, as I classify as H to the third power, which in simple terms is a healthy mind, a healthy heart, a healthy body equals a healthy world. Essentially, we are the tree. We are nature. And we are deeply interconnected with the natural world. This, I felt, was really the epiphany that I learned in my journey.
Pete Seeger, for those who are younger than us, was a cultural icon of bringing folk music and music with meaning into our culture. But he also, in his last years, was committed to cleaning up the Hudson River.
He was.
So he had a boat that went up and down the Hudson River. And I remember when I was in college, I made a pilgrimage to his house one afternoon, just showed up, and he had tea, and it was like being with a Zen master. He was extraordinary, and he was an example of somebody who had found harmony within himself and harmony with nature. And one of the problems that the Secretary General has pointed out is that we're in the Anthropocene, the time in which human conduct is impacting the future of the planet. And the Secretary General said, but we're at war with nature. Don't you think there's some relationship between the human community's war with nature and the inner peace of the individual?
Well, it's a very philosophical question you're asking me. Truth be told is, one of the things I'll share, which I thought was very interesting, is someone said you can't be an angry peace act. You can't be an angry peace activist.
Yeah.
And that really hit home for me, because I started to understand, like, all these people are out there on the middle of the street and they're banging and they're yelling and they're screaming.
Yeah.
They're no different from the other person. So I think really, in terms of like this understanding of war with nature, it really begins with ourselves. And really understanding the inner war and really finding that solitude and finding that peace. Look, nature's going to be around for thousands of years, as Deepak Chopra said. It's really about the essential party of the humans that's at risk here. Mm-hmm. I think, for us, when we think about nature as life, is what is the course we need to take, and what is the journey that's going to enable us to reach a higher level of consciousness, where we're actually going to have an epiphany, where we're going to love our brothers and sisters not by the color of their skin or what they're doing or their job, but just looking at them as just beings. Mm-hmm. And having that essential quality of love and compassion for them. I think this is the intricate component that we need to achieve, and I think once we get there, everything becomes much easier.
I would call that not expanded consciousness, but expanded conscience. In other words, that the first step in the Anthropocene, in this day and age, is to understand, to love your neighbor as yourself. The neighborhood is not a physical location, it's a moral location. And that today, what happens anywhere can happen everywhere. That's number one. Number two, what we do today is going to affect the future generations. That's never happened in human history, the impact of future generations. So neighborhood is not just a physical, planetary location, but it also goes into the future, intergenerational solidarity. And the United Nations Program for Development did a fantastic report last year called something along the lines of Threats to Human Security in the Anthropocene, a Call for Greater Solidarity. And the insight in that is that part of the need to have a harmonious relationship with the natural world also involves greater human solidarity. And I think in this day and age, no state can protect the climate alone. No state can protect the forests alone. These are our lungs. No state can protect the oceans alone. No state can deal with pandemics. We can't have a vaccine apartheid world because a pandemic, a virus will mutate. So we're in this unique moment in history where the insight of the wise and the practical necessity have come together.
Yeah, and I think we're in the we state now. I think we're coming to understand that we are intricately connected to this planet, and that we can't, the idea of being isolated no longer works. It no longer functions.
It's not realistic.
No,
it's mythical.
It's impractical. I mean, the thing now, we're coming to to our own self-awareness is how important our neighbors are.
Yeah.
Right. It's not like, oh, well, it's Canada. Oh, it's Mexico. No, we're North America, or we're a continent. And also, what's interesting too, which I find very interesting as we talk about nature as life, you know, as the fires come through California, they make their way up to south. They also make their way up to Canada too.
Yeah, and when Canada had fires, you couldn't breathe in New York City.
Yeah, and then they come back down. So I think now the conversation has become not, you know, it's become more of an emergency state now.
It's an emergency state in the midst of which there is an emergency on addressing the planetary needs for sustainable development.
Correct.
At the same time, because of, I would say, distorted thinking, we had a terrible war in Iraq. We have a terrible war in the Ukraine. We have terrible
we still
war.
Have a war.
We have a terrible war in the Ukraine.
Yeah. But I would even say this: we have this idea that we can solve our problems by going to war. And the thing that is so disturbing is it doesn't solve that problem.
No.
All it does is just creates a lot of pain, a lot of destruction, and it has no course of rational thinking.
Yeah, what does wind look like?
Yeah.
What does wind look like in a nuclear war? Yeah. And ironic, the nations with the weapons have said a nuclear war can't be won. And yet they're still pouring trillions of dollars into the venture.
It doesn't make sense.
So there's this disconnect between the intelligence we have and the practicality that we're putting in.
No, I would even say
Joe Biden said, "Don't tell me your values, show me your budget."
Yeah, I would even say it's not a disconnect between I think it's a disconnect between ourselves and the natural world.
Yes.
If you're connected with nature and you're breathing fresh air, you love the trees, you wouldn't think about destroying the trees. It doesn't become a hippy-dippy dance where it's like, it actually becomes real.
It is.
It actually becomes to the point where you understand your body, what your body needs, what your planet needs, and you start to, your conference, your compass, it just changes.
Yes.
And I think that's the guiding light that is what's needed here.
That's the change.
What's needed here, and really bringing coherence to that.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, you also hit the point that, there's a lot of us talking about changing our focus from just state security to human security.
What does that mean?
Human security means that we're living in harmony with the natural world, because we can't have human security if we're destroying our home. Human security means that you have freedom, fundamental freedoms, and security in your home and your job, that you have decent food. That's what human security is. And you can't have human security without a sustainable environment.
And I think that's probably the million-dollar question that you asked me. What did I get? I realized that we're all interconnected.
So you didn't start out with that understanding, and you came to it.
I came to it, yeah. Yeah, I mean, for me, you know, I was in my little world, my little silo with my camera, you know, making my documentary. I had, you know, I think when I was in Aspen, and I started to understand the circulatory system and the symbiotic relationship, how the trees actually talk and how they're connected. That was really a big epiphany for me.
Explain that a little, how the roots in the trees actually...
Well, the roots are actually, they're all interconnected. So if one tree is in pain, it'll signal out to all the other trees. If one needs water, then it can tell the other one. So it has a whole circulatory balance, it has a whole circulatory system.
The trees do that, underground. They're talking to each other.
Yes, yeah, they have a whole circulatory system, the aspen trees, the groves. And so they come together, they grow together. And and you don't just see that just in trees, you see that in many different environments. But what's clear is that there's a symbiotic relationship that's happening, that there's a synapsis, that there's an understanding of conscious that we're not really aware of. And then all of a sudden that epiphany, you hit it, you realize it. You said, oh, I'm not alone. They actually are just have much value like I do. And I think, you know, as I was going down this rabbit hole with Rooted in Peace, I started to really, as I was peeling this onion and getting deeper and deeper, that was really the epiphany moment that really hit for me was, oh, I am interconnected with the forest.
Yeah.
I am, as he is with those, as an indigenous elder, so am I. We all have it. It's just something we have to find. And if you seek it, you will find it. And in the end, it's really in our backyard. It's the irony of the whole thing. It's like you just go down a river or creek and you
so
just
close.
listen to it. It's right there. So you don't have to go, you know, you just go walk on a nature trail and you'll hear it. It'll remind you of that time and place.
But you have to slow down and smell the roses, as they say, right?
Yeah.
You've got to pay attention to the reality of the planet Earth.
Yeah, breathe.
And we're breathing the phytoplankton.
Just breathe.
I was thinking that my relationship to the natural world deeply depends on what's going on inside of me. And I'll give an example. Anytime I've ever watched a sunrise or a sunset when my heart is in harmony and is at peace, or if I'm in love, the sunrise or the sunset is overwhelmingly magnificent and beautiful. But if I have anger, jealousy, pride, selfishness, fear in my heart, I don't see the beauty. So there's this deep relationship between the state we're in inside and seeing things as they actually are, the natural world. So I think the same qualities that bring us together as humans are the same qualities necessary to actually understand the natural world. Martin Luther King, in his speech when he gained the Nobel Prize, talked about the relationship between knowing and love. It's a fantastic insight. That he said that, so I thought deeply about that. I was thinking, with what organ do we perceive beauty and virtue? Do you see it with your eyes? Do you see virtue with your intellect? No, it's something deep in the heart. It's deep in the heart. So Jane Goodall, who's a UN Messenger of Peace, and certainly one of the great advocates for real sustainable development, has said the biggest journey for a human is to go from the head to the heart. But then, if you only go to the head to the heart and you don't act on it, it'll wither, it'll be mere sentiment. So it's important to go from the head to the heart to the hand. So what did you, with this insight that you learned in the Rooted for Peace interviews with Deepak Chopra and Pete Seeger and so many scientists and brilliant psychologists, you learned something that changed you. How have you brought that into your hand? What have you done?
It's a great thing. I mean, so let's just start by saying Dr. Roland McCratty, who was the founder of HeartMath Institute, you know, I think it was really interesting when we were in Santa Cruz and we were measuring that deep state of love and you could see the radar going up and up and up. Obviously the outward journey, like putting my hand in the earth. I mean, for me, what really propelled me is 30 years ago when I came back from Israel, I wanted to plant trees. I thought that was the message to peace. I woke up one day in tears and I wanted to change the world. And for me, I created a program called the Giving Tree Rooted in Peace, and I planted about 300 trees in the UMass Amherst in that valley. And then 30 years later, I decided to rekindle that message, and I didn't think it had any merit, and it did. And what came out of this journey was I ended up going in a number of Waldorf schools, did a number of tree planting initiatives, put my hand in the soil, and not just put my hand in the soil. I had all the kids put their hand in the soil. I actually had them, you know, tether the soil.
Yeah, feel it.
Feel the soil.
Yeah.
And then I also did something also very magical too. I brought out a little blue marble, and I got them to see the physical world that we live in our planet.
Yeah.
For them to identify our planet.
Yeah.
And I asked them what they saw, whether it was dolphins or whales or sea turtles. So the idea about using imagination was critical, I thought, as well in my own growth. But truth be said, you know, the physical part of actually planting trees was reborn.
Well, you also did movies about the subject, the movie on Catalina.
I did.
You did a movie on fuel to talk about how we fuel ourselves.
I did.
What I really liked about your book is that at the beginning you have a sense of this inquiry, but by the end of the book, I could feel that you, Greg, took responsibility for what you learned.
I did, and I think it's interesting you asked that question because, or make that point. I think what's interesting now is as I run the, my new frontier, my new opportunity being the Blue Water Film Festival, and curating content that's ocean, water, nature around the world. I'm seeing in real time what's going on in the natural world. And what's wonderful, the idea of being able to curate this art or these films and amplify these stories so that it gives an opportunity for dialogue. It's no longer just, oh, this is happening over there. It's like, no, this is here.
It is all
and
here.
It's now. And to think that Ecuador is as much as a part as we do in New York.
Yeah.
They're very interconnected.
Absolutely.
We might not understand what we're getting from Ecuador.
Yeah.
So I think the more that we use our instruments, we use our film and our knowledge, and we continue to elevate, it provides a sense of hope for me.
I think that most Americans, as most people in the world, don't appreciate the importance of the UN in this moment in history, in this endeavor.
Oh.
And right now you have the UN has the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which really relate to all of these fundamental issues of our climate, dealing with poverty and dealing with the balance between men and women. And when they created the Sustainable Development Goals, the states had funding for this, but after COVID and the war, there's very little money for it. That's why I think that it's important that our tolerance for corruption become much lower, because through tax avoidance, tax evasion, and bribery, between $2 and $4 trillion is taken from the productive economies. And it also, that money uses to corrupt governments, and governments that are corrupted universally have a terrible relationship with the environment. Corrupt governments don't protect.
Yeah.
So strengthening anti-corruption will only help strengthen governments, but also could capture that money to use for the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's so interesting that cycles of virtue like that produce so many good things. And sustainable development, the agenda of the United Nations Program for Development, also requires fundamental human rights, taking care of education, taking care of how people live. And the UN, to me, is so important because it's a place where if you say we, you can mean everybody. And we need that. It's realistic. When did it dawn on you that the UN is important, and how did that happen?
For me, I was very fortunate, Jonathan. I had an opportunity when I first started on my peace pilgrimage.
Yeah.
I got invited to come down to the International Day of Peace by a woman by the name of Evan Matheson, who was the founder of the International Day of Peace. And I was there for the first time, and I met the 4 UN peace messengers. So there was Jane Goodall, Elie Wiesel, Michael Douglas, and Yoko Ono. It was the first time where all 4 of them were in forum, and it was also my first UN experience. They rang the bell. There was a moment of silence. The pigeons flew out. The doves flew out. And it was also a moment where I realized, I was like, wow. I was like, why is Michael Douglas, why is Elie Wiesel, why is Yoko Ono, and why is Dr. Jane Goodall here? And then that was really, for me, a moment that I realized, oh, these 4 people have different careers, have different trajectories, but what is it, and why are they here, and why are they peace messengers? It was the beginning of my understanding of realizing that I'm not alone, that these people had their own families, their own world, but they cared about something that meant the world to them, which was peace. And that was really the beginning of my trajectory into the UN. And I also had a deep affinity, the fact that I was recognizing an international day that most people didn't even know even existed.
Right, September 21st of every
if
year.
I told people that there's an International Day of Peace, they'd be like, what's that day?
Yeah.
What does that mean? And I really thought about it, and it's like, okay, we have one day where the whole world would stop, and we would just put down our arms and just have peace.
Yeah, it'd be fabulous, yeah.
And that's what they wanted.
We might want to do it. We might want to do it all the time.
Yeah, but I'm saying, but the idea that getting to that attention of the world order to realize that, and how important that is.
Yeah, well, I totally agree. That's the bell. That's the central theme. But the UN also is a repository for treaties that are part of the backdrop of the modern world, like the Convention Protecting Patents, right?
Or the new sea treaty.
Or the law of the sea treaty, or the outer space treaty that allows us to have our satellites flying around, or the fact that we have a system of arbitration in the Treaty on Arbitration that allows business to go on all over the world. There's over 500 treaties, more than that, that the UN is the repository for. And that is what allows us to have international trade, you can fly a plane to any airport in the world, even in wartime, because the protocols of landing the plane are uniform. Imagine if every country had different rules of how you land a plane.
There'd be no coherence.
You couldn't do it. You couldn't do it. So you need a place, but more important than anything, in my opinion, it's a place, to quote Ted Turner, where you can jaw, jaw, jaw instead of war, war, war.
Oh, I like that.
It's a place where people can talk, and people say, well, talk's cheap. No, talk may be cheap, but its results can be tremendous. It's impossible to view and to figure out how many conflicts have been avoided because of talking. There's so many examples of good things that happen. The UN is promoting nuclear weapons-free zones. There's over 115 countries in nuclear weapons-free zones. That goes right back to the Bible, saying that you have to leave part of the earth fallow, right?
Yeah.
Or it goes back to the Hindu concept of the natural world being sacred and the indigenous people being sacred. In the Islamic tradition, our relationship to the natural world, it's a trust that we have to return to the Creator. But now we have science telling us we'd better protect nature.
It's all the same. It's just like I said, it's just taking whole in stock and realizing, what's important.
But what's important is that we have a convergence of what's good and what's practical. That's unique.
Yeah, I think it's also what's important is that we realize that, like, before we start knocking down that tree, to think about what does that tree provide for us?
Yeah.
Do we need to knock down that tree? And what's the cost that we're paying? Not the physical cost that it's going to make for the house, but what is the cost that it pays for us in terms of our lifespan? It's a different way to look at life.
A whole different set of questions when you go out on a journey for peace.
Thank you so much, Jonathan.